Cold Case, an Angelica Dale Mystery by P.K. Armstrong. Chapter 31. Mr. Winters did an amazing job on the Aspen Club exhibit. When you first entered, you were swept up by a hauntingly beautiful Irish lament playing in the background. The walls were insulated with a soundproof material colored a dark gray, which blackened the room and thrust everything else in the shadows. The photos were enlarged, and each display glowed with the light from off-white bulbs from small lamps strategically placed to highlight the scenes. It began with aerial and close-up shots of the location and images labeled with the names and description of what each victim did at the club. The next display showed the club at the time Derek purchased the property, pictures of renovations, surprisingly supplied by Stormie, and images provided by the public of nights spent at the club. Bachelor or bachelorette parties and ladies' nights were among those donated. I had a sobering thought. If the fire had been accidental earlier in the evening and had occurred a week before, there could have been a lot of lives lost. It was becoming a popular spot. The next photos were striking, enlarged and in black and white. I saw no problem with sending over some of the images that Jacob had developed of the crime scene, just of the property damage, no bodies. The contrast between the colored lights, inebriated partygoers, and liquor bottles from the previous display, with the burnt-out furniture, bar, and melted glass, was sobering. The anguish only intensified when pictures and news articles detailing the 4 funerals was presented next on a large screen presentation. Each picture faded into another more distressing scene. Copious amounts of flowers draped over coffins, family members being helped to stand because they were collapsing in grief. Heartbreaking. The next display caused a little stir in our group. Scenes from courthouse and trial pictures of Stormie and her attorney being chased by reporters. I looked away and stared at the people I had invited. I know it was a bit Agatha Christie-ish and cliché, but I really felt everyone in this room needed the truth. Moira Adams, realizing I had deceived her, gave me a scowl. I looked over at Delaney Stevens, and together we walked up and both half sat, half leaned on stools placed in the middle of the room. Next to us on a small table, Delaney had set his podcast equipment up. Jacob had volunteered to work the camera. Delaney began by reciting the events as told by police, the district attorney, and the media at the time of the fire. On April 6, 1985, fire broke out at the Aspen Club, killing 4 people: Corey Rowe, Bailey Rogers, Sasha Johnson, and Derek Sampson. Police later arrested Stormie Gyles, Derek's girlfriend, on charges of arson and murder. The case went to trial in September of that same year. The police believed that Stormie Gyles, upset because she had discovered her boyfriend was cheating with Bailey, confronted him in a rage, hit him in the head, and set the fire before fleeing the scene. After a 3-week trial, a jury returned a verdict, not guilty. When asked if they would continue to look for the arsonist and murderer of the 4 young people, District Attorney Blaine replied, "We already know who set the fire and killed those people. Unfortunately, the jury didn't agree." But with that statement, did the authorities do the victims' families, and the community a grave injustice? Did they really get it right? Tonight, I have with me family members of the victims and Angelica Dale, private investigator. Before Delaney could finish introducing me, the double doors to the room opened, and in walked Stormie Gyles on the arm of Sandy Roland. I motioned to Jacob to stop recording, and Delaney stopped the backup audio. Everyone in the room, Chuck, Daniel, Christopher, Delaney, Moira Adams, and Mr. Winters all stared in shock. Most of them knew I had questioned Stormy the evening before. She had confirmed my findings, and I knew she was distressed over the part she had played. I could tell she was physically weak, for she was leaning on Sandy heavily. I walked to her, took one of her hands, and dropped my voice. Stormy, you do not have to be here. She looked at me, her eyes steady. Yes, I need to be here. I think it's important for everyone to know what I have done. I realized after I spoke with you that part of my distress all these years was because I didn't admit my guilt. The families deserve the truth. I glanced at Sandy and she shook her head at me sadly. I tried again. They can learn the truth without you being here. No, it is right for me to be here, she stated forcefully. I had not realized that Christopher had left his place next to his dad and came up behind me. Touching my arm, he said softly, Angel, she's right. Let her stay. Mom is here. We can help if she needs it. He motioned for Daniel to bring a chair, and Stormy had him place it right next to my stool. Delaney, ever the reporter, didn't even flinch. He motioned for Jacob to begin recording again and started the audio. We are also joined by Stormie Gyles. Thank you for coming, Miss Gyles. He paused briefly and returned to his monologue. That night is indelibly marked in the minds of the victims' families and the community as a whole. Osgood had never seen such a tragedy. I think many thought that the trial would bring closure, but when the jury returned a not guilty verdict, it left the community in sort of a limbo. Angelica Dale, you were tasked to shed some light on the case to see if you could provide insight on questions left unanswered by the investigation and the trial. It was at that moment, to the surprise of everyone, Stormy spoke. Maybe I should go first, Angel? She cleared her throat, took a deep breath, and began. Derek and I had been having problems for about 3 or 4 months before the fire. He withdrew money out of our personal account to cover some renovation bills at the club. We fought more and more, and I could feel us growing apart. Stormy's voice was shaky but steady. The lack of stuttering was noticeable. I glanced at Sandy and saw she had noticed it as well. A look of pride was on her face. Chuck grabbed Sandy's hand as Stormy continued. I had started spending time with a friend, and his friendship gave me the courage to stand up for myself. You know, to stop being a doormat. She paused again and this time looked at me, as if she wasn't sure all of a sudden. I smiled gently and nodded at her. She smiled back and plunged in. You see, the district attorney had a couple of things right. One, I did go to the club that night. The room gave a collective gasp. I went to confront Derek about his affair and the money he took. We fought. And then there is the second thing the district attorney got right. I hit Derek. I got so mad at him I picked up a glass ashtray and hurled it at him. It hit him in the head and he went down. As soon as I saw the blood, I thought to myself, I can't believe I just did that. I called his name and I asked him if he was okay. He was screaming and cursing at me to get out, so I ran. Delaney turned to me. Now, Angel, from Stormy's account, Derek Sampson was alive when she left, and she did not start the fire before fleeing the scene. Tell the listeners, does your investigation support her account? I think so, but I think the people here and your audience would rather decide for themselves. The autopsy of Derek Sampson showed the head injury. It also showed that he was alive after the fire started due to the soot in his lungs. But the fire report shows that the fire began almost simultaneously in the office and near the bar. There was accelerant in the office, and a trail of accelerant led from the office to the bar. We know the direction the person was traveling because of the direction of the drops. But couldn't Stormy have started the fire after striking Derek and then walked down the hallway dripping accelerant? No, because Stormy was interviewed later, still wearing the same clothes, and the detectives found no hint of accelerant or soot on her clothing. Besides, if the district attorney's theory was to work, the way the bodies were found also indicated that someone would have had to knock Derek out, start the fire in the office, move to the bar, set the fire, and then physically control Corey Rowe, Bailey Rogers, and Sasha Johnson. This doesn't make sense because Corey Rowe did not have soot in his lungs. He was dead before the fire started. Both he and Bailey Rogers had head injuries, I suspect due to an ice hammer found near Bailey Rogers' body. And remember, Stormy had no cuts, bruises, or injuries, which she surely would have had she fought the other three. Can I interject with a question for Stormy? Did your attorney not point this out at trial? Stormy nodded. Yes, he did point out the lack of physical evidence on my person, but he never conceded that I had been there at all, and he didn't put me on the stand. I think he was worried what my new friendship would imply to the jury. He also felt that once I admitted I was there, the jury would conclude I had set the fire and killed everyone. Besides, you also have to remember, I pointed out, that at that time, Stormy's attorney did not have a working theory of what happened, which is usually what a defense attorney will use to raise reasonable doubt. Thankfully, the lack of physical evidence was enough for the jury. But wait a minute, Angel, Delaney jumped in. You knew the district attorney was correct and that Stormy was there that day, but still you didn't think she started the fire? What else made you realize that? Because the deaths made no sense, especially when you look at the events that led up to the fire. Please explain. Delaney was settling into his interview. In the evidence was an old pager and financial statements for Stormie Gyles and Derek Sampson. The statements were how we discovered Stormie's budding relationship, and we could also see that the club was in financial trouble. The circumstances were perfect for an attempt to commit arson and collect the insurance. Wait, are you trying to tell us that Derek Sampson started that fire? My consultant found evidence of a second hidden policy on the club. It was taken out 3 months before the fire, and there was only one beneficiary, Derek Sampson. I don't understand. Why would he start that fire knowing his employees were in the building? I'll answer that the best I can in a moment. But I think it's important to note that the district attorney and Stormy were also right about something else. Derek Sampson was having an affair. But everyone assumed it was with the young, beautiful Bailey Rogers. But it wasn't. Bank records show weekend trips for Derek and Sasha Johnson. Moira Adams, quiet up until now, gasped. Apparently, Delaney didn't tell her we knew about the affair. A retrieval program was used on the pager, and the illicit messages between them also proved the affair between Derek and Sasha. You are about to tell me that Sasha Johnson was involved in the attempt to collect the insurance, Delaney said somewhat breathlessly. Yes, I am. Thanks to Moira Adams, Sasha Johnson's niece, the diary of Sasha was discovered and had shed light on their relationship and the details of their plan to burn the club, collect the proceeds from the insurance, and their one-way tickets to Mexico. Unbelievable, Delaney declared. Delaney had begged me not to tell him all the details so he could give authentic responses. And let's talk about Sasha for a moment. In addition to the evidence of an affair, I was shocked to learn that Sasha Johnson was removed from the scene, still alive. Her last words were at first reported to be pyre, pyre. Investigators later concluded she meant fire. Like burned alive on a pyre? That's archaic. Delaney's face showed confusion. Yes, I had dismissed it thinking she was saying fire as well. That is, until I noticed the name of the company that held the insurance policy on the club. Higher general liability insurance. I looked around the room as I let it sink in and saw everyone's mouths slightly opened in shock. I waited for Delaney to respond. No way, he shouted. At his exclamation, everyone else in the room began whispering in excitement. After reading the pertinent pages of the diary, Delaney begged me to allow Moira Adams to make the right decision, and in the end she did, reluctantly. I think deep down inside she resented the fact that she would not get to use the crime and the sensational trial to rocket her into some kind of media stardom. I think Delaney hoped that by agreeing to release the content of the diary, Moira would magically realize that popularity or status was not worth the risk of another's reputation. I think Delaney would be disappointed. So Sasha and Derek had planned to burn the club and collect the insurance and start a new life in Mexico. Then how did they and the other two employees end up dead? Delaney asked, and I grinned when Sandy and Chuck both said out loud, yeah. First, remember that the city was working on the roads that week. Derek had been notified that there would be water shutoffs. The tank system, experimental at that time, would have only been partially full, and it may have taken 24 hours for the water pressure to be strong enough for the sprinklers to be effective. Additionally, images show a valve was not properly closed, which would have also limited the available water supply. With the evidence I have discovered, I would have given this alternate theory of events. After fighting with Stormie and being physically struck, Derek doesn't pass out right away. Stormie leaves in a rush, and Corey and Bailey leave for the day soon after. Sasha walks in, and Derek is bleeding from his head. She asks if he is all right, and he said fine, and asks if everyone is gone. She says yes and hands him the stove oil. He starts throwing it everywhere, pulls out papers in his office, and tosses them on the floor, pours oil on his desk, opens file cabinets, and pulls out more paper. He hands her back the oil, and Sasha walks out towards the bar. He pulls out a lighter and lights some paper on his desk and in the file cabinet. I believe at some point he begins to get dizzy from the fumes. Derek falls into an unbalanced file cabinet and passes out, bringing the file cabinet down on top of him. The photos prove he was covered by a file cabinet. Meanwhile, Sasha has dripped oil down the hallway and begins spreading it over the bar, breaks some bottles of 80 proof whiskey, and is about to use a lighter when she hears Corey return. I think maybe he forgot something, his wallet, keys, or something like that. His father tells me he had a habit of forgetting things and having to retrace his steps. Corey sees Sasha and runs up to her and grabs her arm. She tries to pull away, but he's too strong. She looks around and sees an ice hammer, grabs it, and hits Corey right in the head. This fits because Corey died before the fire was started. Sasha lights the lighter, and the liquid on the bar immediately ignites. Unfortunately, Bailey returns, more than likely to check on Corey when he doesn't come back, because the plan was for Corey to give Bailey a ride home that night. Depending on the timing, she could have returned just in time to see Sasha hit Corey and fling a match, starting the fire on the bar. By this time, I imagine there is smoke coming down the hall from the office. Maybe Sasha looks around to see if Derek is coming to join her, and then she sees Bailey. She knows what she has to do. Grabbing the hammer, she's on Bailey instantly. Bailey attempts to run away, but Sasha catches her. They struggle, the smoke filling the building. Sasha lunges at Bailey and catches her in the side of the head with the hammer. By this time, she's out of breath and can't see due to the thickness of the smoke. She staggers toward the fire exit, using the last bit of breath to try to call for Derek. She drops the hammer, takes two more steps, and collapses. Sasha was found nearest the exit, wasn't she? Delaney confirmed. Yes, which might explain why her body wasn't as damaged and she was found still alive by first responders. Delaney allowed time for the story to sink in. I watched the faces of Susanna, Tony, Moira, and Stormie. Slowly, there was a shift in the room. Susanna began to cry, and Tony began comforting her with tears in his eyes. Moira showed no sadness, just irritation. But when she caught my eye, she immediately looked at her hands resting in her lap. Stormy sat, seemingly looking past me into the distance. Well, I think between the evidence and your theory of the crime, you've given us all something to think about, Angelica Dale. Thank you. Delaney motioned for Jacob to stop recording, but he left the audio on. Tony was hugging Susanna, but suddenly she broke away from him and went and kneeled in front of Stormy, who was still seated. Susanna picked up one of Stormy's hands and rubbed the top of it softly. A torrent unleashed, and Stormy began to sob. Susanna moved forward and enveloped Stormy in her arms. You blame yourself, don't you? Susanna asked. Stormy nodded and kept crying. Tony walked up to join them. He rubbed Stormy's back and his deep voice uttered, the only reason Derek and our children are dead is because Derek and Sasha decided to burn the club. Had they not, Corey would have picked up his keys and taken Bailey home, and Sasha and Derek would have walked out of that club moments later, alive. The jury got it right. You are not guilty. He pulled Stormy to her feet, and he and Susanna wrapped her in a hug. There wasn't a dry eye in the room.